Hello and welcome everyone to another episode of Align, where we help you align with your true self, others, and your desired outcome to live your best life. So today we have a very special guest, Nick, a longtime friend of mine, and a little bit of background for this topic. As we've kind of done last couple of sessions before, we talked about ESG, impact investing, much more in the finance realm. And so as people who are quite familiar with ESG and finance, it's been in a way pioneered by the European countries, and Europe is miles ahead in US than the US. So it's interesting now to think about what about ESG in sports? Like, how do we think about it today? Where have we, how far we've gone? Where are we going? And so I definitely wanted Nick to come and to speak about this because, I mean, she is based in London. She's a European background. And most importantly, while we met and while we had our careers in finance, she is pivoting and transitioning into sports, which has always been your huge passion. So Nick, let's start there. I mean, I feel like you've always been such enthusiastic about it. So tell us about how you got into it, sports, why it's so important to you.
Yeah, no, thank you for that introduction. So yeah, as you know, like many people, sports has just been a big part of my childhood. But I grew up in Cyprus, a small Greek island, so there wasn't, while you could have access to it on, the TV or what have you, there wasn't that much going on around us there, especially not for women. You just had to play with the boys if you wanted to play whatever the sport was. And yeah, kind of always had it on the radar, in particular football or soccer for you. I think a nice story that kind of tells you the dedication level was our school were doing a school trip to China, and obviously funded by the parents, obviously. And I really wanted to go to the Bobby Charlton Soccer School, which is near Manchester. It's where David Beckham went. And my mum said, look, you can't go to both. I'll pay for one, not the other. So I ditched the school trip and I went for a 2-week residence football camp where I was one of 2 girls in the entire camp. And yeah, I'll go to China one day.
Yeah, one day, that's for sure. That's
Yeah.
awesome. And I'm sure it also helped, right? Because like for me, in finance, as someone who's not only most recently gotten into sports, much more so, it was a little bit of a disconnect for me to like really bond with a lot of my male colleagues because every single time it was like March Madness or football season, and they would talk about all these things, and I'm like, I didn't watch it. I'm sure for you, it was such an easy and natural way for you to bond with your male peers.
Absolutely. I spent the last 6 years of my banking career working with hedge funds and asset managers, obviously male dominated, no issue. But when you're on the sell side and you're trying to get them on side, you need common ground. And I was on the relationship management side, and being able to connect and talk about sport, know who their club was, know what the headlines were. It meant that, it definitely built a foundation. And I leveraged that, shall we say, whenever anything went wrong.
Yeah, that's awesome. Because I remember every day before Monday, before we're going in the office, I would literally study headlines so I knew everything and I had to like find out about it. So you definitely had a bigger leg up than most of us who weren't crazy passionate about it. So let's talk a little bit more about why people now are caring so much about ESG in sports. Is it because, I mean, ESG is kind of blown up in the finance world and now we're kind of pivoting to sports, or what do you think are motivating the care and interest?
Yeah, I think it is definitely that. And then you've got to add on the kind of pandemic lens as well, for sure. And I think, sport, despite being very long standing, there was a lot of clubs that were kind of founded, the earliest clubs in the 1800s. It kind of was a standalone because it was a hobby that then developed into something more commercial. Whereas other industries, they've been commercial from the get-go because that's how it had to be. And I think while finance has led the way, I think the impact of the owners, the investors, whoever it is, into the industries that they're invested in has kind of really helped with that. Because if ESG is on their agenda, it really filters through top down from the boardroom to the field. And then ESG has also just become a thing in business in general. And I think as we know, some of the sporting organizations and companies have become so huge. They are some of the largest businesses out there. While we'll talk about the players, the teams, the results of what happens on the pitch, they are huge businesses with like billions of dollars of money being transferred in whichever shape or form. So it needs to be run like a business. So ESG has been on the agenda, but it's been nicely accelerated, shall we say, over the last year for sure.
Yeah, awesome. So how far have we come from like now? What are some, highlights in ESG within the sports world? Can you share with us to start? Let's start.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's unsurprising that the E is probably the easiest to start with, and that's where a lot have started. If you think about some of the largest stadiums in all our respective countries are predominantly there or associated with at least one sports club. They then get used for other things like concerts, events, or what have you. And I think the kind of footprint that those stadiums and the fans have is easy to quantify, measure, and therefore, if you're doing something against it, you can measure the impact that you're having. So the E is definitely already up there. And they're really pushing that. If you attend any sporting related seminar, event, whatever it may be right now, there will always be a section on sustainability. And that will cover both E and S from my perspective. So they're doing things from inside the stadium. They'll only work with partners, so let's say food vendors that are using, they'll reduce all the single-use plastic. So if you don't have that in your manifesto, they won't bring you into the stadium. They will only use maybe local practitioners. So they'll use hopefully local builders to actually build the stadium itself. They'll use locally and sustainably sourced food. They're starting to get a little bit more inventive. It's not just hot dogs and burgers. There'll be a vegan option, all of that stuff. So they're becoming more kind of socially aware from the environmental front, if I can merge the two. And then all the way through to things like thinking about how their fans get to the stadium. Is their stadium in a place that, is hard to get to? Does that mean that everyone has to drive? Is there public transport so that we can reduce the emissions? And, and they think about that. The huge groups like the City Group, who obviously famously own Man City, but, they own clubs all around the world, and they have to think about that and the impact locally. What they do in the UK might be easier, but, they have to think about, Mumbai, what they apply in Manchester, they can't apply the same over there. So, they've got to really think about it globally as well.
Got it. So yeah, you mentioned the E part is the big focus, and we kind of spoke about it too. The S, would you say, is a less so? And then let's talk about the G and the governance too, because especially in in the UK, it's very different. We can kind of talk about the business model as well. In the US, everyone knows the amount of money. It's kind of I feel like when people get like billionaires or the multimillionaires, their first thing as a guy is, hey, I'm going to go buy a team sport, right? So there's a lot of money backed in the US sports, for the most popular ones at least. So what's going on in social? What's going on in governance?
Yeah, so from a social perspective, I think it's probably helpful to look at both elite sports and non-elite sport, because when we're talking about the upper echelons, it's obvious they all have a foundation, i.e. their own charity that they're associated with. Some clubs like Barcelona, if you sign for Barcelona in the soccer world, you're already signing over 0.5% of your salary to go into the foundation every year. So, things like that is quite good. They all have academies. So, they like to train up the kids from youngsters. It can prevent having to pay these ludicrous fees at a later date. And then therefore how they care for those youngsters and what they do for them, there's definitely an S aspect in that. But then, as you work further down the clubs, they just don't have money for this stuff. And unfortunately, the first thing to go might be things around those sort of areas. So as you can imagine, the disparity is huge. But I guess the exciting thing about those areas is we can talk about sports teams all we want, but the more systemic organizations, so the agencies, the sports agencies, whether it's talent agencies or marketing agencies, and the data providers, whoever it is, they are a lot more established and more of a kind of well-oiled business, shall we say, a traditional business, and they can really impact and drive that space. And it means that when you're thinking of partnerships, so let's just talk sponsorship because it's the easiest relationship that everyone understands, is the key decision makers can actually really drive the agenda and say, we will only partner with you if you do X, Y, and Z, or if you prove that you are interested in X, Y, and Z. And I think that's really powerful because they're the people that, like, they have control of the purse strings. If a sponsor said, look, I'm not going to sponsor your team unless you do something, right, and they were the biggest sponsor, and sponsorship can account for a third of an annual income for some of these clubs, guess what? They will figure out a business way of doing it. So yeah, I think, we can have agencies lead the way, like I said. You're starting to see new agencies, like boutique ones, coming up with social in their name and in their real purpose, not just an add-on, but saying we will only deal with sports stars who have a social agenda and a bit of a purpose and align their values. And then they'll also give advice on clubs who say, look, we really want to do this, we just don't know how.
Yeah.
And they'll really help drive that. So I think that will be probably a real way to dial it up. But it is there, you just don't hear about it as much. It's not as cool, so it doesn't hit the headline.
Got it. And then also a bit about the governance, right? Because you mentioned, especially in the UK world, the players may get a ton of money, right? But it's most of them you mentioned were nonprofit. So let's talk a little bit more about the economics behind the governance side.
Yeah, and I mean the headlines, probably the minute you hear it's nonprofit, things are tougher, right? If you're nonprofit, okay, it doesn't mean there's not money passing through, but it means it's all immediately reinvested. So things will be harder. But yeah, it does impact the governance side of things. I mean, it really depends on the sports. The older sports, I would liken to some of the older industries that we know and love, whether that's the automotive industry, the banking industry. They learn as they go and they adjust. So, we would have described banking as being a pretty well-governed, well, maybe we would from the inside, a pretty well-governed industry. But then 2007, 2008 happened, and they went, oh, we have to readjust, and just whacked in loads of regulation. The same thing happens in sport. If I look at football in 2011, they were like, hold on, there's all these billionaires just coming in and just literally investing as much money as they have in their pocket into these clubs. That's an unfair advantage. So they brought in the financial fair play rules to try and level the playing field. The jury's still out as to whether that's worked, so maybe not the best example, but they're trying. But then, in better news, compare that to the newer sports. So I don't know if you've heard of Formula E, but the E stands for electric. So it's a motorsport using electric vehicles. Cool. Take a wild stab in the dark as to what one of their main values is about. It's the environment, right? So that is at the forefront of what they're doing. And they therefore kind of really have embedded that in their entire governance, because that has been there from the beginning. In fact, it was debuted in Beijing, I think, in 2014. And I think, you've got to have a lot of praise for kind of, that side of the world, because their innovation, especially in technology, which is what's driven this, has really helped propel it. And I think it's Nissan who they've kind of put it out there that they have aimed to achieve carbon neutrality across all of their operations by, I think it's 2050 or something like that. And a way of doing that is they've committed to signing up to basically be involved in Formula E, because by investing in the cars required in the competition, it will propel the progression in the technology of electric vehicles. So it helps them because they can kind of bring down their kind of carbon footprint, but it also helps everyone else, because that means all of the electric cars that you and I will drive inevitably in the future they'll come around quicker, they'll be better. They'll be better for the environment because of the innovation that they're putting in there. So I thought that was quite a unique way of kind of I guess having an impact. But yeah, I digress slightly. But the reason why, another reason why I brought up that sport actually is we touched on partnerships and saying that the sponsor, you know, they have the cash, they can kind of perhaps maybe persuade people to play ball. You know, Formula E is another one where they've said explicitly that they will only work with partners who, and they put kind of KPIs in their contract, and they actually, because they insist that their partners do certain things, they appreciate therefore that actually the profit margin or the value that that partner will get out of the relationship is reduced, but they don't mind. They're like, look, commercially, we know this isn't as attractive, but what's important to us is that it's important to you. So what they then say to them is, if you're going to struggle to do what we ask, we'll work with you. We're not going to put a time limit and say, we won't do this. You're just not getting involved. We'll say, okay, fine. This is where we want you to be in 5 years. And they help them get there instead of just blocking them out. Which again, it's that collaboration. It's the kind of influence, which I think is very forward thinking from a business perspective. It's not so black and white.
Yeah, no, I like that for sure. It's not kind of a take it or leave it, right?
Yeah.
Where are we going? You kind of touched on some of the things, but you know, what are some things that are coming up or things that we candidly need to do more of in the ESG world?
Yeah, I think we're moving in the right direction, and both the pandemic and the younger generations are key to really driving that. I mean, I touched upon investors and sponsors, to be fair. You know, they have the power from a pure monetary perspective, but the fans, both from a monetary perspective, to be fair, but also from the kind of, you know, supporting and the impact that they have. You know, I think that they've always had power because of fan loyalty and how unique that is to sport versus other industries. You know, you wouldn't see in other industries someone saying, oh, that's my favorite brand of soft drink. And then if they're not doing well anymore, or if their product no longer tastes as nice, I'm not going to keep drinking it. I'm going to say, no, I don't like that anymore. And I'm going to flip and easily just start drinking something else. Whereas if my sports team starts really doing badly, gets relegated, I'm still going to support them. I'm still there. So it's a really unique kind of relationships that you have with fans. And it's really important because there's, I think, a lot of old school thinking in sports, which I think needs to very rapidly readdress what the younger generations need, because they have a much stronger ESG radar, shall we say, and are a little bit more fickle, actually. They're not afraid to kind of flip and change. So, you know, I think there's a lot of work to be done to keep them happy, but they're a really good benchmark.
Yeah.
If clubs could just survey them and use them for the ideas, do a focus group, do whatever you want, I think they would be good advisors for the boardroom.
Yeah. And you make a good point about, you know, the younger generation being able to flip and switch, right? I think it just shows, I personally noticed a difference between kind of the older generation, more afraid to make mistakes and kind of don't fix what's working in a way, right? Whereas the new generation is very open to embracing, hey, I strongly believe in something, I want to go for it. If I'm wrong, I can pivot, right? So it'd be very interesting to see, like, how do we, obviously on both cases, very extreme, right? You can't be pivoting left and right every day, like you're never gonna get anything done. At the same time, if you're always just stuck on one way of doing things, how are you ever gonna innovate? How you're ever gonna, you know, if you don't question yourself, like, am I right? Like, is this the best way? You're gonna get wiped out by the new generation coming in, right? Who's willing
and you'll
to
get left behind.
Yeah.
Let's be honest. Some people can argue that, you know, oh, but these things take money. I'm going to struggle to make a business case for it. The best business case is you will be left behind. I can't promise that it's going to increase your profits for next year. But when everyone else starts doing this stuff, even baby steps, in 10 years' time, when all of a sudden they're going to overtake you, it's like the, you know, kind of tortoise and the hare scenario. You've got to be involved. Otherwise it won't. Then you will unfortunately just see the negative impact.
And it's very much so also know your client, right? Like, know your customer. Who are your customers coming in? This is what they care about. So you got to get with the program.
It's marketing 101. Segmentation, right?
Exactly.
Your segment is a certain age group, and unfortunately that age group's desires, values, and whatever are changing.
Right.
So you have to kind of roll with it, whether you like it or not.
Right. I'm with you. Actually, a perfect transition, speaking of the
Mm.
younger generation. And I say that loosely, but I consider us also, the millennials, also the quote younger generation, right? Let's also,
We're old at heart.
that's true. We're old souls, right? For sure. Or we're like grandparents, honestly, the way we are. But if you think about the younger generation, social media has obviously changed the game in terms how everything is done, how we consume media, how we get our news, how we, how our beliefs, everything's being shaped with social media. So how has social media raised awareness in sports in your eyes, and for the better or for the worse?
Well, the good news is, I think in general, it will only help with the ESG agenda, because everything everyone does is visible.
Yes.
So if you claim to be doing it and you don't do it properly, you will be found out. And if you're not authentic in doing so, you will be found out. Because unfortunately or fortunately, we can see what you're doing and we can have an opinion on what you're doing and voice that, and it can pick up serious weight very quickly. So I think, if people have been cruising, and this obviously is not specific to sport, it's for every industry, but given the viewership that you get of sports on these platforms, they have to take it seriously.
Yeah.
When you look at who's the most followed on Instagram, probably Ronaldo, or who is it? Like, the number of people that they have following them is insane. And LeBron, right? He's just now dabbling in increasing his investment in Liverpool. Well, guess what? The number of people that follow LeBron, like I was just having the same conversation earlier today, that he went from having a stake in Liverpool itself to a stake in FSG, their parent company. And it didn't seem to make sense on the surface of the math of, like, they've given too much away. And I thought, hold on, by getting him on board, the value he's bringing is just purely because of his viewership.
Yes.
Or not purely, sorry, that's highly unfair. I think he's extremely good at what he does in the boardroom, but it makes a difference. And so I think it's gonna be extremely positive at driving change, and keeping people honest, which is only a good thing. But I suppose there's always negatives that come with it, that people will, unfortunately, perhaps individuals will therefore be blamed rather than organizations, and but I think there's nothing you can do about that. If you choose to be in the public eye, that's where you are.
Yeah, you made a really good point with LeBron, or any kind of person with what I call social capital, right? I think especially with 2020, it made it very clear to everyone that social capital will only get more and more important going forward, and that's where you're going to monetize, right? That's where the dollars are going to go. I mean, you made a really good, you made an interesting point. I was actually shocked as well, where, for example, in the UK, the S part isn't necessarily the biggest element yet. It's much more focused on the E of the ESG. But in the States, if you look at the ESG in sports, it's S, it's social. And it's all these things, to your point, going viral. Like, you can't hide behind videos that people take of you, things that you say, where you've commented, what you've mentioned, right? So all the social issues and the things that we're dealing with in the States, that was completely magnified, if not started, by social media. So yeah, it'll be very interesting to see. People, they say your net worth is your net worth. I really believe the next decades, this will be absolutely true. The way to build your financial capital will be social capital.
Yeah, and it's the new thing. It's the new celebrity, right?
Yes.
It's a bit like having superpowers. If having superpowers is you're a good footballer, or you have, 10 billion followers with zero skill, doesn't matter. That's your superpower. You have reach. But there's a fine line between being a hero and a villain, because it's what you do with it. And unfortunately, before, people would just follow. If you think kids back in the day, they'd say, oh, that's the best football player, that's the best basketball player, then they're my hero. Now you need to prove that you're a hero once you're there. And that, the responsibility is huge.
Yeah.
They get paid enough to deal with the responsibility.
Wait, what's that?
They get paid enough that I'm not feeling sorry for them. They can deal with it.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point because I feel exactly you mentioned, right? Because social media lets you see all parts of someone's life, I'm no longer judging you just based on your skill set in whatever field you choose to make your profession. I'm judging you based on your character. I'm judging you based on your integrity. I'm judging you based on the way you conduct yourself every single day in your life. And it's interesting to see, I mean, again, it's spiraled by the new generation. We just care about it's not just you're good at your job. That's not enough.
Well, do you know, I don't know if it made its way to the States, but it would be remiss of me to have this conversation with you without mentioning Marcus Rashford, who plays for Manchester United. So he's a young guy. He's like early 20s. And he started petitioning at the beginning of the pandemic, I think, for free school meals for children who weren't at school. So over here in this country, if your parents can't afford to feed you and you go to what we call a state school, you will get a free school meal because provided by the government based on kind of a number of things like household income, etc. Now the pandemic hit and kids weren't at school anymore. So the families were losing out on these free meals, and they were having to, you know, try and feed their kids more than they would have before. And there was just this massive imbalance that these people were losing out on what was meant to be a governmental support for them. And he came out and started petitioning it for it and saying that kids who were kind of signed up to have this free school meals before when they were in school should still be able to access them. They should come and pick them up or have them delivered to their house or whatever it was while everyone was in lockdown. And I think it helped that, you know, I think he came from that sort of background. So he benefited from that in his youth. He kind of really connected with it and said that he knows that his mum would have struggled if he was still in school age, and he pushed for it. And everyone initially was kind of saying, oh, wow, isn't this great? Look at him, like he's this unicorn, which, don't get me wrong, it's brilliant what he's done, but it saddens me that he is so rare, because there's also a part of me thinking, well, why wouldn't you be using your platform for stuff like that? You know, I mean, in short, the government originally said no, and then he pushed so hard that the government said yes. So he'd made massive like impact on millions of kids' lives.
Yeah.
And it was, you know, a big deal and continues to be a big deal over here. And hats off to him. It's brilliant what he's done.
Yeah.
But it just frustrates me that he's on this pedestal because he's on his own.
Yeah.
You know, so I think we're moving in the right direction. And by nature of the generations, the younger sports stars themselves will bring that with them.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, it's no surprise that he's one of the younger people on the team.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that the more tenured guys don't believe in the same stuff. They just understand maybe social media and how to use it a little bit more.
That's a really good point. And also not just in the sports world, right? Like I feel like any public figure, or even anyone, an everyday person, right? I feel like I constantly I constantly hear people saying to me that there is a fear of putting themselves out there to be the first one to do something, right? What if it's not taken the right way? What if I don't make it? What the fear of failure, right? So I hear you. It's frustrating to hear that he's the only person that's doing this.
Yeah.
That fear of being the first, the fear of being ready to all that is so real, right? That I feel if people just really listen to their intuition versus the outside noise, they will know what they should be doing. It's like that authenticity that you mentioned, right? If it's really coming from the heart, people can tell, versus you're using it as greenwashing. You're using it as a way to kind of get more followers and get attention, right? People can tell the difference. We're not idiots.
Yeah. You know, I'm so glad you've mentioned greenwashing, actually, because I came across this phrase of sport washing recently, where it's not something I'd considered before, right? So kind of, you know, the facts are some of the main sponsors I'm going to take football or soccer for us, because I've got more kind of stats for you in that place. But, you know, the main sponsors are actually from kind of have an extremely large environmental footprint, shall we say. So they're in the airline industry, kind of manufacturing or automobiles or that sort of thing. And there are some people out there who are perhaps cynical, and they say, well, while these companies are like kind of sponsoring sports, you just got to be really careful that they don't have a hidden agenda and they're not actually amending their own operations and kind of making the changes at home, but they're actually just saying they're sponsoring sports because it's known for an active and healthy lifestyle and perhaps being a little bit more socially and environmentally friendly, if I can call it that. And they're actually just sponsoring that in order to, you know, build their own, kind of prevent the need for them to also make changes on their side. Which, don't get me wrong, the whole point of branding and marketing is to benefit from your counterpart's brand. Like, that's not new, that's not a kind of crime, but doing so in order to, especially around ESG and the environmental stuff, it's like, if you're doing that just to then not preach it yourself, preaching it without actually doing it, I should say, is where you could kind of trip up. So there's a lot of cynics saying it doesn't mean don't deal with, you know, these types of sponsorships. Of course, it's such huge money, but you need to kind of impart, you know, the things that we would have seen in the investment world, right? KYC, just do your due diligence and say, right, if you're going to accept, I don't know, $10 million off this company, you need to dig deeper into them beyond their balance sheet. And there has to be a real ESG element to your partnership methodology.
I kind of tying back to the importance of social capital, which I think will be already, but going to be much more important. Don't take that short-term game and give up that long-term. You don't want, again, everything is being watched, recorded, whether you like it or not, and people can see it. If you're taking this short-term $10 million check from someone who's super not aligned with who you are, you will absolutely regret it down the line. Because you'll look back and people will dig up even if you've made it, right? People will dig up and say, hey, wait, didn't this happen X years ago? You guys weren't in line, you took the check anyway. Or the worst thing is when you have say you're a majority investor, right? They have the power to sway you away with their dollars of your true mission. So then what's kind of the whole point of you getting into the business? This is your baby, right? You're essentially letting the dollar sway you away from the reason why you built the business.
Yeah, and I think the easiest way to, I guess, prove your point, as it were, is not all sports clubs are privately owned. Some of them are publicly owned by thousands of people. And like in particular, I mean, Barcelona, again, all my stats might be in European football, but
no, it's good.
Like, you know, they famously have kind of literally thousands of members who vote, and you know, they control the club. They absolutely control the club and all the decisions that are made. And I think, funnily enough, though, it means that the management team really struggle because they are being held to absolute accountability. So when they try and make commercial decisions that are perhaps, like you say, a little bit more rash and only focusing on the profit, if there's no kind of people element, you know, if it goes against the grain and against the values, the members just vote against it. And their hands are tied and they really struggle. I think sometimes to really convince, they have to convince all of these people with a vested interest, which it's good, but then maybe it's kind of bad if you're looking at it from a pure business perspective, that, you know, they might need to get themselves out of a hole and make a couple of business decisions to, you know, for whatever reason. So that's tough. That is very tough.
Got it. I'm learning so much. Wow, Nick, this is awesome. And what about the way women are being impacted from this wave of ESG? You know, how far we've come, where are we going, how we can do better?
Yeah, I think there's two main points on it, which is, I think there's obviously been a lot of noise this year for kind of around diversity and inclusion initiatives across the board. No need to kind of mention the big ones. And that's really positive because it has really, I think, propelled all industries to kind of, or just made them stop, take a minute, step back and rethink and reset. And that's not a bad thing, not just from a kind of, you know, female perspective in sports, and obviously I'm touching upon that because it's, again, a male dominated environment.
Yep.
All the kind of obvious,
Facts are
all the
facts.
obvious things that go with it, that's fine. But I think one of the things that I'm seeing more on the recruitment side is women, sweeping generalization alert, are perhaps less afraid to be more vocal on ESG. Just down to, again, very stereotypical personality traits and all the rest of it. And actually, I'm seeing a lot of noise about where organizations are purposely trying to proactively make sure that, you know, when they're interviewing for a role, that they have a very diverse range of candidates, et cetera, et cetera. But what we're finding is that actually women, other than box checking, are also bringing a whole lot of other valuable traits that they hadn't foreseen.
Yeah.
And I think even if organizations are box checking in order to get it, kind of make initial progress, I'm not actually that bothered about it in the short term, because they will soon realize that the decision is extremely justified when the governance of their organization is kind of improved, I don't know, 5-fold, 10-fold, whatever, because of our drive towards ESG.
Yeah, yeah. And I think I mentioned this to you too, but in the States, and don't quote me on the sports, I'm pretty sure it was basketball, but I get my sports news from Instagram, because I'm definitely not one who like hunts it down and follows it. And I'm like, but I'm always on Instagram, so I'll follow specific accounts. And I think it was I'm pretty sure it was for basketball, where one of the women took a picture of the training room, which only had, for women, it had like one rack of weights, and the men had the entire massive gym, right? So to your point, women kind of keeping each other accountable. With social media, they are not afraid to put it out there to say, hey, public, this is what's going on. And so to your point, even though, a lot of the sports teams in the States is privately owned, in a way, it's being publicly held accountable through social media, right? So while Barcelona will have literal vote, like people voting for it, and, you know, keeping the powers that may be accountable, it's your everyday person, your buyers and your fans that are looking at these videos going viral, being like, well, I'm either cool with this or I'm not cool with this.
Yeah, no, it's true. And I think, you know, that's not a unique scenario. You know, you hear of horror stories of if there's a sports club that has a men's team, academy, you know, youth teams, and a women's team, that, you know, the women's teams tend to, if they're all sharing the same training grounds, the hierarchy goes men's, youth, women's, and women's have to turn up for a 10 p.m. training because they have to wait for the 12-year-olds to get off the pitch. And you're like, there's something not right with this picture. So it's definitely not unique. And I think the pandemic, if anything good is going to come out of the pandemic, it's those sorts of inequalities, because it's not preachy. It just seems so obvious. But I think it was this: if it ain't broke, don't fix it. You know, it just, I don't know, it was just how it was done. Yeah. Whereas it's really brought things like that to the forefront, where men, women, whoever, are kind of going, well, hold on, is that really what we're doing and how we run it? No, that's not right. Let's change that. And suddenly people have the time to kind of reflect and kind of make things right.
Right.
So yeah, I think social media, along with the pandemic, has kind of, just meant that we can take a few steps forward and reprioritize maybe.
And I also want to take accountability as a consumer of media, right? And it's part us as the viewers, and it's also part the media companies who are kind of in control of what gets prime time, what doesn't get prime time. But I mean, if you think about it, the sporting world as a business, the male sports are way more watched than females, right?
Yeah.
So if you want to talk purely financial economics, okay, well, if most people are watching the men's sports, they should be better funded. Let's talk purely business, right? So in a way, there has to be fixed in terms of viewership of these sports. I don't have the answers. I know you will as you transition, but that's something that I feel like as viewers, we also need to take responsibility. How can we use our voice and demand certain sports that we want to watch more of and to make sure it's available to us?
Yeah. And that's where you start looking into the wider world. You got to start talking to broadcasters
Yep.
and saying, look, I can switch on the telly and find a men's game of pick a insert sport here
Yeah.
at any time of the day.
Yeah.
What if I wanted to watch the women's team? Oh, that's right. They're not even shown, which again, I understand it's down to viewing figures, but there's a real chicken and egg balance, which is going to have to be struck here.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think broadcasters will have to step up and, like you say, be afraid to be the first one to do it. We've seen just coincidentally this week some massive announcements in women's sport in the UK. So Sky Sports have just struck a deal with the BBC. So Sky Sports being paid for and the BBC being free to air. They've just struck a deal with the women's kind of top tier soccer team league, excuse me. And then literally, I don't know if it was yesterday or today, there's been a new deal announced for the Women's World Cup rugby. And now suddenly these things are getting more airtime. And guess what? It should snowball.
Yes.
It should snowball. And from a business case perspective, because I know we always have to justify these things, which I understand. I completely understand. But I think the absolute numbers are so low that your return on investment will be bigger because there's more room to grow.
Yeah.
Okay, the absolute will not be comparable. It won't. But that's fine. If you're talking about kind of value for money and return on investment from a pure economics perspective, there is that room to grow. We're nowhere near that ceiling.
Right.
So, it should be a good place to put your money. And as you can imagine, there's so many forums and so many discussions about investment into women's sport. Just like I said, from an economic perspective, from it's the right thing to do perspective. And then it goes deeper, which we could do a different session on. But, a fun debate is, well, should it be bundled in with the men's or should it be its own asset?
Yeah.
I'll let you use your imagination on pros and cons of both, but it kind of goes on.
I like the way that you highlighted some of those things. So what I want to kind of give the audience an opportunity to think about how they can add to it. If they care about ESG in sports, understanding my audience, they do. So what are some ways that how can we empower the audience to take a stand, add to this, be progressive to the ESG in sports world? What are some things that you would highlight?
Yeah, I think have an interest in it because, and what I mean, you might say, oh, well, I do. That's why I'm listening. That's why I'm all ears on this question, but I think it's really easy to find. I think I was ignorant to how much clubs actually do. And I think a lot of it gets done in the background and it's not advertised very well. And I think the ones who are doing it really well are really taking their fans into consideration. So, I alluded to some of the changes made at stadiums, but, it goes further to say, well, how do you get to the stadium when you go to match day? What you're eating, what you're consuming while you're there. But, they're providing e-bikes or carpooling for their employees or, whatever it is. Like there's an actual physical doable thing that a fan can do when they consume sports. But at the same time, do your homework because I think we can use social media and there's power in numbers. And I think if you have something to say about it, say it, because I bet you're not the first person. I bet you're not the only person, and there's power in numbers. The consumer is, especially the fans. I mean, we discussed at the beginning that fans are loyal to the brand. They're there through thick and thin, and clubs really do support that. And lastly, I would probably just touch on grassroots or non-elite sport, because that is ultimately the pipeline for the elite. We only talk and really think about the elite top of the game, but as you can imagine, everything we've spoken about, the gold standard, immediately kind of cut when you start going further down towards grassroots sports. So I think supporting grassroots sports where you can will really help build that up from the bottom up. And then hopefully we'll meet in the middle somewhere.
Yeah, I love it. Awesome. Like, I want to say thank you so much. I feel this is
Thank
the perfect,
you.
of course, this is a perfect example of how you're so good at being understanding and meeting people where they are in terms of their understanding level, their excitement about a topic, and you're able to really push people along, but in a way that I don't feel like you're selling me, in a way that I feel like I'm genuinely learning from you. So, and that's always been the thing that I thought, like the day that I met you when we were in London, I'm like, I like this girl. I've always learned so much from her, but she doesn't make you feel stupid or silly for not knowing. And you kind of explain in a way that actually excites me to learn more. So I know, I'm sure everyone listening is going to be finding a way to be more active ESG, but I always wrap up with asking people what they think their unique gift is, because I feel everyone has a gift. They need to use it. So what is your gift that can really help enhance your community and world?
That's a really good question. I wish I was prepared, but
this is why I don't like to prepare any of my guests. Authentic.
And very kind comments. I'll start with that to stall for time. Gift. I suppose I would say considering everybody. And I'm going to keep that really broad, but I'll explain what I mean. So if you're having a conversation with someone, whether that be on a personal level, for a reason, a business purpose or what have you, is always considering the other side of the equation. And it probably actually is a bit of a cheat because it ties in with what you were just saying earlier about kind of bringing everyone to the table and kind of really trying to understand their point of view. And I think that's really come out in the last year and something that I've tried to do more of because it can take effort. So, if you're just in everyday life, no matter what you're doing, if you consider everyone else around you, both physically and from just what's going on from their point of view, I think you're bound to make friends and succeed.
I love it. Well, thank you and how perfect to tie the name of podcast Align. Well, thank you.
There you go.
Nick, I cannot wait to see you when we're vaccinated and I'm going to London, or you're coming here, or we're meeting in, I'll go to Cyprus or Greece anytime. Yeah. So I'll let you know once I'm vaccinated.
Perfect. I look forward to it. It's been nice to speak to you. Thank you.
Of course. Talk to you soon.
Take care. Bye-bye.